Today, we're diving into a really fascinating and, let's be honest, often misunderstood topic. What is the real relationship between using cannabis regularly and having a psychedelic experience? The answer? Well, it might seriously change how you think about both.
So here's the big question we're tackling. Does a daily habit, something like cannabis use, actually alter what's often called a journey of a lifetime? As you're about to see, the connection between these two is way more complex than you might think.
All right, first things first. To really get how they interact, we need to understand them on their own. Think of it like two separate stories, each with a very, very different ending when it comes to long-term chronic use.
And right away, the contrast is, well, it's night and day. On one side, you've got chronic cannabis use, which can be linked to things like cognitive issues and a kind of emotional flattening. But then you look at classic psychedelics, and the story is all about lasting well-being, a greater sense of openness, and a totally different risk profile.
So, let's zoom in on heavy cannabis use for a second. The research points to potential problems with memory and attention, something called amotivational syndrome, that feeling of just not wanting to do much, and even that emotional blunting we mentioned. It also messes with your REM sleep, which is super important. And for people who are already vulnerable, it can raise the risk of psychosis. And of course, you can't ignore dependence and withdrawal. That's a real thing.
Now, flip the coin. The profile for classic psychedelics, it's just fundamentally different. For one, these experiences are so intense that most people aren't exactly lining up to do them every day. Your brain also builds tolerance incredibly fast, making daily use pretty much pointless. And this is crucial. There's no physical dependence. The risks are real for sure, but they're much rarer and usually connected to someone's pre-existing conditions.
So, this all brings up a really huge question. Addiction. Why is it that one of these can get its hooks into you while the other one just doesn't? The whole answer is buried in how they talk to your brain's reward system.
Let's actually break this down side by side, because this is where it gets super clear. Look at that first line, reward pathway. THC gives you a direct shot of dopamine. That's the core of what makes things feel rewarding and, well, addictive. Classic psychedelics, they don't really touch that system in the same way. Then there's tolerance. It builds slowly with THC, but with psychedelics, it's like a brick wall goes up almost instantly. The result? Dependence is pretty common with daily cannabis, and it's basically unheard of with psychedelics.
Okay, so we've set the stage, right? Two very different substances, two very different stories. But this is where their worlds collide. And honestly, this is where things get really weird. We need to talk about the mystery of the blunted journey, this consistent report from users that cannabis can actually make a psychedelic trip less intense.
Now, your first thought might be, oh, it's just cross-tolerance. We're using one drug makes you tolerant to another. But nope, that's not what's happening here. Not at all. See, THC and psychedelics are knocking on completely different doors in the brain. THC uses the CB1 receptor, while psychedelics use the 5-HT2A receptor. From a purely chemical standpoint, they shouldn't be interfering with each other like this.
And yet, you just can't ignore the flood of reports from what I like to call citizen scientists out there on forums and Reddit. This quote really nails the common theme. People describe it as a fog that settles over the experience, making it less clear, less powerful, and forcing them to take way more of the psychedelic just to break through.
And we're not talking about a small effect here. This is a big deal. Facilitators who guide people through these journeys report that chronic cannabis users might need a dose that's 20 to 50% higher to get the same results. That's a lot. So, if it's not chemical tolerance, what on earth is going on? Well, the leading theory is pretty fascinating. It's not about chemistry, it's about psychology. It goes like this. Chronic THC use tends to quiet down the amygdala. That's your brain's fear and anxiety hub. This basically creates an anxiety buffer. The problem is, a lot of the deep, transformative work in a psychedelic state comes from confronting and surrendering to difficult emotions. With that buffer in place, it's just harder to let go. So you end up needing a higher dose to push past that baseline calm that the THC has created. But just when you think you have it all figured out, the story takes a massive twist. Because while cannabis might blunt a psychedelic journey sometimes, it's also hiding a pretty big secret. At the right dose, cannabis is the journey.
That's right. At very, very high doses, THC itself can behave like a powerful psychedelic. It can trigger the exact same kinds of profound states people report from things like psilocybin or LSD. We're talking full-on ego dissolution, mystical-type experiences, and major emotional breakthroughs. All of a sudden, that clear line we drew between them gets really, really blurry.
And when I say high dose,
The scale is just wild. A normal recreational dose of THC, say in an edible, might be around 10 milligrams. A psychedelic dose? We could be talking about 100 milligrams or even more. This isn't just a stronger version of the same feeling. It's a completely different kind of experience. The intention and the dose change everything.
So how does this even work? How can cannabis do this? Well, that massive dose of THC just floods the CB1 receptors. This creates so much noise that it disrupts the default mode network. That's the part of your brain that runs your ego, your sense of self. It also lowers the amygdala's defenses, which can allow suppressed emotions or trauma to come to the surface for processing. And here's the kicker. It even indirectly starts to activate some of the same serotonin pathways that classic psychedelics use as their main highway.
Okay, let's pull all these threads together. What's the bottom line here? And more importantly, how can you use this information to navigate your own path?
So, if you're going to remember anything from this, here are the big ones. First, these two classes of substance have totally different risk profiles. That's non-negotiable. Second, cannabis can indeed blunt a trip, but it's doing it by creating an anxiety buffer, not through chemical tolerance. That's why a lot of people recommend taking a break from THC for 1 to 4 weeks before a psychedelic journey. And finally, never forget that dose and intention are everything. At high enough doses, cannabis itself can be an incredibly powerful psychedelic tool.
And that really leaves us with this huge open question. As these lines between substances start to blur, and as we get smarter about their incredibly complex interactions, what does that mean for the future of mental health treatment? It's a pretty exciting and, I think, really important thing to be thinking about.